Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's pretty simple. We take complex source material, all the research, the articles, the really dense papers, and we try to pull out the insights you need.
Right. The goal is to help you get that knowledge quickly, but also thoroughly. And today, we're diving into something that might just fundamentally challenge how you see reality itself.
It really might. We've synthesized a whole collection of, just fascinating scientific and philosophical work, and it all argues that our most common approach to understanding the universe. It's powerful, sure, but it's also incomplete.
Inherently incomplete.
Okay, so let's unpack that right away. When you come across something complex, what's the first thing you do? Your natural instinct.
You break it down. Yeah.
You break it down, exactly. You use reductionism. It's the approach that built the modern world. You want to understand a car.
You study the engine, the transmission, the pistons. You get into the guts of it.
Right. You want to understand life. You drill down to the DNA. You want to understand a government. You study the individual laws of the different branches.
And reductionism basically assumes that if you can just understand those simplest components, well, then you understand the whole thing.
But that's what our sources are pushing back on. They point out that this misses a fundamental truth, that the most surprising, the most, beautiful and important properties of the universe, they arise not from the components themselves.
But from how those components are organized, the arrangement is everything.
That's where we're going today. Our deep dive is all about this concept of emergence, these unexpected creative laws that govern reality when pieces combine and interact.
We're pulling out the most surprising, the most counterintuitive, and really the most impactful takeaways about how complexity just builds, layer upon layer, right across the cosmos.
I like the symphony analogy you brought up earlier.
Oh, yeah. Think about it. You can analyze every single note in a symphony. You can study every instrument, the physics of every vibration in the air.
But the feeling you get, the emotional impact of the music.
It doesn't live in any single one of those components, not in a single note or a single violin. It resides in the collective structure, in the pattern, in the arrangement of it all.
And that's the core realization we want you to walk away with. Reality isn't some static collection of parts. It's a creative, continuous process. We've structured this deep dive around three really mind-bending insights that are going to challenge your basic assumptions about cause, effect, and matter.
We're starting small, and then we're going to zoom all the way out to the cosmic scale.
So first, we'll establish the fundamental mechanism, this concept of emergence. We're going to do that by asking a very simple question. Why are properties we take for granted, like wetness, purely a function of collective action?
Then second, we're going to introduce the idea that the universe is not just a simple, bottom-up chain of cause and effect. We'll look at something called downward causation.
That's the mechanism where the whole system actually influences and constrains its own parts?
Exactly. It's a feedback loop. And finally, we will zoom all the way out to map the entire universe as this vast, continuous cosmic ladder, a nested hierarchy where every single rung creates entirely new rules.
And we'll show you precisely where you stand in that magnificent structure. All right, let's jump straight into our first surprising takeaway. And this is one that often sounds like a bit of a philosophical game, but it's a fundamental scientific truth.
It is. The headline is, Why Wetness Isn't in a Molecule.
This is just the perfect entry point for understanding emergent properties. It uses something we all know, water, to show how something totally new can arise just from organization.
Right. So emergence is defined as these qualities that appear only when simple parts interact to form a complex whole. These are properties that are, completely absent in the individual components themselves.
And the central idea here is genuinely counterintuitive. If you could somehow isolate a single molecule of H2O, just the two hydrogens and one oxygen, that single molecule is not, in fact, wet.
Not at all. You can't drop a single molecule on a table and get a splash.
So if we could magically just, pull one out and observe it, what would we find?
You'd only find its intrinsic properties. Things like its mass, its velocity, the specific angles of its bonds, and, this is the crucial part, its chemical properties. And the most important of those is polarity.
Okay, let's pause on polarity for a second, because this seems to be the fundamental ingredient that allows the bigger thing to happen.
It's the key ingredient, yes. Polarity just means that because the electrons aren't shared equally, the oxygen atom is a bit greedy, it pulls the electrons closer to itself.
So one side of the molecule gets a slight negative charge.
And the other side, where the hydrogen atoms are, gets a slight positive charge. This little electrical imbalance is the key. But, and this is the point, That property itself is not wetness.
No, wetness. That quality of being able to flow, to stick to surfaces, to form a droplet, that is a collective systemic behavior.
It requires billions upon billions of these tiny polar H2O molecules all interacting with each other.
And what's governing that interaction?
That's where you get the famous hydrogen bonds. The slightly positive end of one water molecule is attracted to the slightly negative end of its neighbor.
They're not super strong bonds, right?
No, they're weak, they're transient, they're constantly breaking and reforming. But their collective effect is profound. It's what causes the molecules to stick together, that's cohesion, and to stick to other surfaces, which is adhesion.
And it's that massive coordinated stickiness under the right conditions of temperature and pressure to keep it all liquid that we perceive and call wetness.
Exactly. Wetness is an organizational pattern of movement and bonding. It's not a thing, it's a behavior of the system.
The source material we looked at has a perfect summary for this.
It does. It says, the property of wetness is not present in a single water molecule. This property emerges only when a large collection of molecules interact dynamically, demonstrating that the emergent property resides in the collective structure rather than the individual molecule.
So the organization literally creates the property. But here's the critical question, the nuance that I think our listener will really want to get. Isn't this just a fancy way of describing a phase change, like ice melting into water? Why do scientists make such a big deal about the word emergence here?
That's a great question, and it takes us into a really vital technical distinction. Wetness is what scientists would call an example of weak emergence.
Weak emergence.
Or you might see called reducible emergence. And what that means is it's not magic. We don't need to invent new laws of physics to explain it.
Okay.
If we had a powerful enough supercomputer, we could, in principle, model the position and interaction of every single H2O molecule. And from that, we could perfectly predict the property of wetness using only the underlying laws of quantum mechanics and electromagnetism.
So the novelty is in the arrangement, but the explanation can still be traced or reduced all the way back down to the fundamental laws governing the parts.
Precisely. The novelty is just. It's unexpected if you're only looking at the level of the components. You wouldn't guess it just by looking at one molecule.
But this definition, this idea of weak emergence, it becomes incredibly important when you start thinking about other more complex things.
Yes, because it implies there might be something called strong emergence or irreducible emergence.
Tell us what that means, because that feels like a huge shift.
Yeah.
If weak emergence means we can reduce the explanation back down to the parts, what would strong emergence be?
Strong emergence would be a property or a phenomenon that cannot, even in principle, be fully deduced or explained by the underlying components and their known laws.
And the classic, and I guess most contentious example of this would be?
Consciousness.
Right. So we have all the parts. We have the neurons, the synapses, all the measurable electrical activity in the brain. That's our bottom level.
But the subjective feeling of seeing the color red, or the internal experience of the qualitative nature of consciousness itself, some scientists and philosophers argue that this cannot be reduced merely to the filing patterns of neurons.
They're saying the organizational complexity of the brain creates something fundamentally new, something that might actually require its own set of high-level laws to explain it.
Precisely. If consciousness turns out to be strongly emergent, it would mean that even if we had perfect knowledge of every single molecule in the brain and how it behaves, we would still be missing the complete mechanism to explain the experience of subjectivity.
It's a huge debate in science, obviously.
A profound philosophical split. But just recognizing that there's a spectrum of emergence from something easily reducible like wetness to something potentially irreducible like consciousness, that's essential for understanding how reality builds itself.
This brings up a really critical point about the scientific method itself, which I think is important. If the novelty, the really interesting stuff, is held in the collective structure, doesn't that sort of undermine the scientific ideal that everything should be reducible? I mean, if we can't isolate the wetness of water or the consciousness of the brain, how do we even study it?
It forces us to change our methods. It forces us to adopt what you might call methodological holism, especially for complex systems.
Holism meaning looking at the whole.
Exactly. When you're studying the climate or an economy, you must look at the system level. You simply cannot isolate one molecule of CO2 or one individual stock trade and expect to understand global warming or market volatility.
You'd miss the entire picture.
You have to focus on the rules of interaction,
Yeah.
the feedback loops, the organizational patterns that define the whole system. The sources we look at really emphasize that the moment you move into studying complex systems, your methodology has to shift from pure isolation to one that's focused on systemic connectivity.
So the key takeaway from the whole wetness example isn't just that water is sticky, it's that understanding how that stickiness arises teaches us that new laws and new properties are unlocked by organization.
And that these new properties might be reducible or they might not. It's the moment the universe gets creative. And this creative power of organization is what generates our next big, surprising takeaway. That once a system is created, it immediately begins to influence the very components that made it in the first place.
That sets us up perfectly for our second mind-bending insight. If emergence shows us how complexity arises, how organization creates these brand new properties, well, the logical next question is, how does that complexity stick around? How does it maintain itself?
And this brings us to this really astonishing feedback loop known as downward causation.
Our normal intuitive understanding of causality is it's almost always linear and bottom-up, right?
Oh, completely. Simple components cause complex structures, quarks cause atoms, atoms cause molecules, molecules cause cells. It's just a simple chain flowing upward from small to big.
But the universe is so much more dynamic, so much more interesting than that, because those complex structures we were just talking about, the emergent levels, they exert control back down onto their own constituent parts.
That is downward causation. It's this powerful mechanism where the higher level system constrains, it influences the behavior of its lower level parts. The structure of the whole literally dictates the function of the components inside it.
I think the heart analogy from the sources is fantastic here. It makes it really concrete.
It's perfect. Let's look at the two forces that are at work at the same time. We can start with the simple bottom-up flow.
Okay.
Individual heart muscle cells, they're called cardiomyocytes, they contract. Their action, when you sum it all up, generates the force that causes the heart to pump blood. That's pure, simple, bottom-up causality.
A causes B. The cells contracting cause the heart to pump. Easy enough.
But now, let's look at the whole system. The heart isn't just a jumbled pile of contracting cells. It's an organ. It's designed to be a highly synchronized pump working within the entire circulatory system.
So the high-level functional requirement of the body, maintaining blood pressure, making sure oxygen gets everywhere, that acts as a constraint.
A powerful constraint. If you take those individual cells and you put them in a petri dish, isolated, they'll still contract spontaneously, but they'll do it randomly or irregularly. They're just free to contract based on their own internal signals.
But when they're integrated into that highly structured organ, the heart,
then the heart's overall architecture and rhythm, which is itself an emergent property of the whole circulatory system, imposes control.
the system dictates the tempo.
Exactly. You have specialized structures, like the pacemaker cells, and they force those individual muscle cells into a coordinated, synchronized contraction. They're constrained by the needs of the whole. They're forced to execute a function pumping blood rhythmically that they would never and could never perform in isolation.
So the whole actively reduces the behavioral possibilities of the parts. It limits their freedom for the sake of the system's stability.
This is such a critical point. Downward causation doesn't change the underlying physics of the cell. A muscle cell still contracts according to its basic chemical laws. But the high-level system determines when and how those laws get applied. It's like a boundary condition that's imposed from above.
That's incredibly powerful. It really challenges that core assumption that we can understand everything just by isolating the smallest piece.
Right.
Because if that smallest piece is being constantly regulated and constrained by its environment, by the level above it, then looking at it in isolation fundamentally distorts its true functional behavior.
To really solidify this, let's step away from biology for a second and look at non-living mechanical systems. Because downward causation operates there too.
Give us a good example of a mechanical feedback loop.
Okay, think about a simple house with a thermostat. The bottom-up causation is easy. The furnace fires up, it converts fuel into heat, and the individual molecules of air in the room start moving faster. The temperature rises.
Simple enough. Now, where's the downward causation?
The high-level system is the thermostat setting. Let's say you set it to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature setting is an emergent goal. It's an abstract constraint.
It's just a number, an idea.
Exactly.
Right.
But when the actual temperature in the room drops below 70, that abstract system turns on the furnace. The high-level goal, the idea of 70 degrees, actively regulates and initiates the behavior of the low-level components, like the furnace firing and the fuel burning.
The abstract concept of warmth is literally dictating the physical consumption of gas.
Precisely. Or, to get even broader, look at an economy. The behavior of individual companies is the bottom-up action. They make things, they sell them, they try to innovate.
But the emergent property of that whole system is the market price for a commodity.
Yes. And that emergent price, which is really just a numerical abstraction that results from billions of individual trades, it immediately exerts downward causation. Well, if the market price for the widget your company makes suddenly drops too low, that high-level economic system immediately constrains the behavior of your individual company. You're forced to cut staff, or reduce production, or find cheaper materials. The whole system forces you to behave in a very specific way to align with that emergent price signal.
And what about the systems we all live in every day, our societies? The sources pointed out we should probably expand on the social implications. Where does downward causation show up in culture and governance?
It is absolutely everywhere, and it's often very subtle. Take language itself.
Okay.
Language is a classic emergent structure.
Yes.
It wasn't designed by any single person. It just arose from eons of collective social interaction. But once a set of rules becomes established, it imposes downward causation on every single individual speaker.
You can't just string words together however you want and expect people to understand you.
Exactly. The emergent system of English grammar dictates the order of your words, the tense you use, the very structure of your thought. It constrains your individual linguistic choices to make sure the high-level function communication is actually achieved.
What about things like laws?
Cultural norms and laws are textbook emergent properties of a society. They constrain your freedom of movement, your behavioral choices, every single day. Traffic laws, for instance. They're an emergent solution to the problem of managing millions of individual cars on a road network.
So the rule stop at a red light is a downward constraint.
It's a downward constraint imposed by the whole system to ensure collective safety and efficient flow of traffic. And if you choose to ignore that constraint, the system, through law enforcement and penalties, will aggressively correct your behavior to get you to align with the needs of the whole.
This really shifts our perception of personal agency, doesn't it? If we are all components in this massive nested structure, and every level above us is actively constraining our behavior through grammar, through laws, through economic pressures, even the biological rhythm of our own heart, then how much of our perceived free will is just us, the individual part, performing the function required by the whole system?
That is the profound philosophical implication that these sources raise. Downward causation doesn't eliminate individual agency, but it definitely reframes it. We're agents, but we're operating within a highly constrained environment.
We can choose which road to take, but the road network itself, the system we didn't design, limits where we can ultimately go.
And understanding those systemic constraints is the absolute key to navigating any complex organization, whether you're talking about an ecosystem or a corporation.
This idea of systemic constraints feels like the perfect link between our first 2 points. Emergence creates novelty. It builds the ladder, so to speak.
And downward causation ensures that the ladder is stable by forcing the lower rungs to align with the needs of the rungs above them. So you have novelty creating organization, and then organization establishing rules.
It's a constant reciprocal cycle. Upward emergence and downward constraint, meaning reality is never static. It's a continuously creating, self-regulating hierarchy.
Which brings us, naturally, to our third major takeaway, zooming out to see the entire sweep of this creation, the universe, as a continuous nested hierarchy, what the sources call a cosmic ladder.
Okay, so we've established the core mechanisms. Emergence creates new structures and new properties. Downward causation stabilizes them by imposing rules from the top down.
Right.
Now we're stepping back to reveal the grand structure of the universe that this entire process has built. And the concept here is that the whole universe is a nested sequence of organizational levels, a continuous ladder of rising complexity.
And crucially, there's no apparent top rung. The organizational complexity is continuous. And each run that stabilizes, it creates new emergent properties, new laws, new degrees of freedom for the next level up to build upon.
We can trace this ladder across 4 major domains, starting from the most fundamental level of reality we know.
Let's start right at the bottom with the building blocks, in what the sources call the physico-chemical domain. This is the foundation, governed by the forces we usually think of as just fundamental physics.
So the absolute foundation is?
Fundamental particles.
Right.
Quarks and leptons, existing in the chaos of quantum mechanics. But stability emerges very quickly. Quarks combine, using the strong nuclear force to form stable protons and neutrons.
And that combination is the very first act of emergence, the property of nuclear stability.
It is. Without that stability, atoms couldn't exist. The universe would have just stayed a uniform plasma.
Okay, so from stable protons and neutrons, the next step is atoms.
Next, protons and neutrons assemble with electrons to form atoms. And this is a massive leap in complexity. The emergent property here is chemical identity, meaning the number of protons now defines the element. Hydrogen behaves completely differently from oxygen, not because of some new fundamental force, but simply because the arrangement of electrons in their shells allows for specific, predictable chemical bonding behaviors. The entire periodic table is an emergent structure.
And from atoms, we move up to molecules. This is where complexity really starts to accelerate.
It does. Atoms bond to create simple molecules, and then those simple molecules can assemble into massive, highly complex macromolecules. This is where you get things like polymerization and protein folding.
And there's another fascinating emergent property at this level, right? Handedness.
Yes, chirality, or handedness. A lot of biological molecules can exist as non-superimposable mirror images, like your left and right hands.
And even though the underlying physical laws are symmetrical,
Life, overwhelmingly, uses only one-handedness. For example, only the L-amino acids are used in human proteins, not the D-amino acids. That choice of left-handed over right-handed is an emergent property of life's system. It's a high-level constraint that was imposed very, very early on.
okay, so we've built the chemical toolkit. The emergence of those complex macromolecules, specifically things like proteins, lipids, and DNA, they provide the organizational blueprints and the machinery needed for the next big jump, the transition into the biological domain.
This transition is often called the greatest mystery in the whole hierarchy, but it's really just an organizational leap. The macromolecules don't just float around, they organize themselves into organelles specialized machinery inside a cell, like mitochondria or ribosomes.
And the emergence of these specialized parts allows for the formation of the first living cells. The cell is such a critical rung on this ladder.
It is, because it unlocks entirely new categories of existence. We're shifting from just chemistry to self-sustaining systems.
The key emergent properties of a living cell being.
Metabolism and self-replication. A cell is a system that's capable of managing its own energy and information flow, and crucially, of recreating itself. No single molecule, no matter how complex it is, can do that on its own.
Those functions only reside in the coordinated activity of the entire organizational system. The cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, all working together.
Exactly. And from the cell, the ladder just spirals upwards very quickly. Single cells specialize and group into tissues, muscle tissue, nervous tissue.
Tissues form organs, the heart, the liver. Organs work together in systems, the circulatory system, the nervous system, the respiratory system.
And all of this culminates in the complete organism, the vessel of independent survival and complex behavior, whether that's an ant or a human. This is the level we typically think of as individual existence.
But the individual organism is really just a component in the next emergent domain.
The socio-ecological domain.
So now we're looking at interactions beyond the individual body.
Right. Individual organisms form populations, which are defined by sharing a gene pool and competing for the same resources. These populations then interact intensely within communities, creating these incredibly intricate webs of predation, competition, and symbiosis.
And these systems have collective behaviors, right? Things you'd never see at the individual level.
Completely invisible at the individual level.
Okay.
Things like animal migration patterns or predator-prey population cycles.
And when you combine those living communities with the non-living physical environment, the water, the rocks, the atmosphere, you get ecosystems.
And ecosystems are defined by a whole new emergent set of rules. The flow of energy and nutrients. The stability of an ecosystem is an emergent property. The rules governing a desert ecosystem are radically different from the rules of a coral reef, even though the underlying physics and biology of the organisms are the same. The difference is purely organizational.
And you can scale that up even further.
You can. Ecosystems make up biomes, these vast regions like tropical rainforests or boreal forests. And the emergent property of a biome is its ability to regulate the local and even the regional climate through massive biological activity.
Like the Amazon absorbing huge amounts of carbon dioxide.
Exactly. And the ultimate apex of this natural biological hierarchy is the biosphere itself, the entire zone of life on Earth. The biosphere is the largest natural system we know of.
And it has its own massive global-scale emergent properties.
Absolutely, like the regulation of atmospheric oxygen levels and the global carbon cycle.
Wait, hold on. That's astonishing. Are you saying that the collective activity of all life on Earth, from the tiniest phytoplankton all the way up to elephants, is actively maintaining the conditions necessary for life to continue to exist?
That's precisely what the evidence suggests.
So the planet itself, through its emergent biological organization, is exerting a form of downward causation on the environment.
Yes. The presence of oxygen in our atmosphere, for example, is not a chemical accident. It's a biological emergent property. Life created the oxygen, and then that high-level atmospheric composition imposes a necessary constraint on the metabolic pathways of almost all complex organisms today.
So if the oxygen level dropped,
The biosphere would exert downward pressure on all individual life forms, forcing them to adapt or, well, go extinct.
that brings us to the latest, and you could argue the most unstable domain on the ladder.
The human and artificial domain.
This domain begins when human societies start creating emergent structures that rely less on purely biological interaction and more on shared abstract information.
Things like culture, formalized governance, written languages, and these vast systems of collective knowledge.
These are abstract emergent systems, but
Yeah.
they have immense downward power. I mean, money. Money is just paper or data points in a computer.
But as an emergent system, it dictates global resource distribution, individual labor choices, and even international conflict. It's incredibly powerful.
And these societies, which are propelled by these powerful abstract structures, are now building the newest rungs on the ladder.
Technological systems that are beginning to mimic and extend biological complexity. We're talking about global networks, massive data farms, large language models, AI. These are biodigital systems, and they represent a totally new level of organization that is already developing its own unique emergent behaviors.
And the complexity here isn't just in the hardware, is it? It's in the emergent behavior of all the collective data and the algorithms.
Right. When a large language model starts showing abilities like complex reasoning or creative generation that were not explicitly programmed into its base code by a human, that is a form of powerful emergence. And these systems are already exerting downward causation on us.
How? I mean, we're the ones designing them, so aren't they just bottom-up products of our design?
Initially, yes. But once the system achieves sufficient complexity and stability, the constraint flips. Think about the sheer size of the global internet, or the incredible pace of financial trading algorithms.
They dictate the speed and format of everything.
They dictate the speed, the format, the content of human communication and economic decision-making. Your individual behavior on social media, what you read, how you react, what you decide is important, it's being constrained and channeled by the emergent design and the algorithms of the platform itself.
The system is limiting our attention and dictating our informational input to optimize its own high-level function.
We are becoming components in the various systems we created. It's a perfect summary of downward causation in the digital age.
And the sources don't even stop there. They touch on a theoretical future level.
They do, the transcendental level.
This is where we're shifting from established science into, let's say, intellectual speculation. But it's a logical extension of the hierarchy we've been describing.
It is. If the trend continues emergence creating higher stability and greater downward control, where does it all end?
What do the models propose?
They propose a stage of post-singularity intelligence, maybe involving some kind of planetary scale collective computation or a true biodigital fusion. But the key theoretical aspect of this level isn't just its computational power.
It's the ability of this emergent collective consciousness to potentially manipulate the fundamental physics of the levels below it.
Changing the rules of the game entirely. The ultimate demonstration of downward causation would be the ability of an emergent intelligence to modulate the speed of light, or the strength of gravitational constant, or the fundamental laws of chemical bonding.
Not just through some random fluctuation, but through directed intentional will derived from a higher organizational structure.
If the universe really is this continuous engine of creation, then the hierarchy is still actively building new levels of reality right now.
And our current emergent structures, our global networks, and our AI systems are likely the raw materials for the next completely unimaginable rung on that ladder.
Right.
So let's try to synthesize the three major pillars of this deep dive. We started by challenging that reductionist approach, which is really the scientific default, and hopefully we've started to replace it with a much more dynamic, more creative framework for understanding, well, everything you see.
We established three connected, really vital insights. First, that reality is a creative process. Emergence shows us that all this novelty arises simply from organization. It proves that the collective structure is often more critical than the component
The
parts,
reproducible wetness of water.
to the potentially irreducible mystery of consciousness.
Second, we introduced that surprising feedback loop, that this new organization immediately imposes constraints, that the whole bends the parts to its will through downward causation.
We saw that in the synchronized rhythm of the heart, the constraints of grammar on our speech, and the regulation imposed by something abstract like economic pricing.
And third, we mapped this continuous process onto the entire cosmos, showing that this process seems to be unbounded. It creates this vast, nested hierarchy that stretches from quarks all the way up to planetary biospheres and, well, potentially beyond.
What's truly profound here, and what the sources really emphasize, is that complexity may not have an endpoint. This hierarchy isn't a completed tower. It suggests that the universe has the potential for infinite novelty.
Constantly using the stable emergent levels as a foundation for the next, more complex structure.
The rules of reality are not static. They're constantly being rewritten and layered on top of each other. The most important features of our world, whether you're talking about life or the economy or consciousness, they don't reside in the simple objects. They reside in their intricate, evolving arrangement and the rules that govern their collective dance.
So if the universe has already built this cosmic ladder, stretching from fundamental particles that follow simple quantum rules all the way up to global consciousness and these self-regulating planetary biospheres, we'll leave you with this provocative thought.
What new, unimaginable levels of reality might emergence be building right now, using human society and its artificial intelligence systems as the current, active, and maybe unstable rung on that ladder? What are the new rules being written that will soon be constraining your behavior?
Something profound to chew on until our next deep dive.